Good morning. My name is Lisa Raju Kessler, and I'm here to lead you in a meditation this morning. And so today I was going to talk about anger. Um, I was thinking about how we've just celebrated, so to speak, our 2-year anniversary of the first case of the COVID virus being found in the U.S. and coming up on the anniversary of when we started shutting down and living our lives quite a bit differently. And when I think about that and I think about how I've responded and many people have responded to this situation, a lot of feelings that come up. Frustration, loneliness, certainly anger too. Anger comes up too. And it's unfortunate, that we have these feelings of anger, um, maybe towards other people who are not practicing as safely as maybe we would like for them to. Also just anger in general that our lives have changed the way they have. Certainly anger over um, people getting sick, people dying. I mean, people having long-term effects from this virus. Um, and then, of course, when we're in a more frustrated sort of space in our head, we often react with anger to certain situations that maybe we would have handled a little bit better if we didn't have the stress that we have in our current life. So, with that said, I went to some readings by Thich Nhat Hanh to find some things to discuss and then practice as we do our meditation. So here's something that I found that Thai, which of course is a familiar way we refer to Thich Nhat Hanh. So here's something that Thai wrote. He said, in the Buddhist tradition, we have the practice of mindful breathing, of mindful walking, to generate the energy of mindfulness. With that energy, we can recognize, embrace, and transform our anger. Mindfulness is the kind of energy that helps us be aware of what is going on inside of and around us. Anyone can be mindful. When you breathe in and you know you are breathing in and you focus your attention on your in-breath, that is mindfulness breathing. The basic practice of Zen centers is the practice of generating mindfulness every moment of your daily life. When you are angry, you are aware that you are angry. Because you already have the energy of mindfulness you created by your practice, you can recognize, embrace, look deeply, and understand the nature of your suffering. So, if you would like to utilize mindfulness as a way to deal with anger when it arises, then we're going to practice that a little bit today. A couple of things I just wanted to say. One is that, when we think about all these emotions that we identify as negative, I believe, as do many people, that all of these feelings basically get back down to fear. Why is anger generated? Perhaps we feel hurt, we feel threatened. There is fear behind that feeling, and anger is a way that we often lash out at others. So, when we notice the anger, what we sometimes do, unfortunately, is that we react with some kind of violence. It may be violence in our words, or it may be violence in our actions. Often people say, well, it's not good to just stuff down your feelings and hold on to that anger. But there is a third option, and that other option is to really sit with your anger, to understand what that anger represents. And one way of doing that is to consider that whatever another person may have done that you're reacting to, that that person is not necessarily trying to provoke you, but that that person has many misconceptions, and that they're actually a victim of their misconceptions. If you consider that that person who you feel maybe kind of provoked your anger in some way, if you consider that that person is actually suffering and that's why they're behaving the way they are, then perhaps you can have compassion for that person. And when you view it that way, well, you can then engage in compassionate listening and perhaps even open up a dialogue. Now, Ty, as many of you may know, he was dealing with the Vietnam War and things that were going on. And certainly that would bring up suffering for him and for his people during that time. And he chose to see how the people that were fighting, including the Americans, how they were suffering, and how he could speak with leaders in America in a way that would promote a dialogue, a compassionate dialogue. So Ty goes on to tell us, and I'm going to read this here. We get down to this part. So he then talks about some deep listening, and he talks about 3 different steps in that. And the first step, he says, is to go back to your breathing. And so we usually can feel anger starting to arise in our body. And it may be helpful to you to notice what that feels like. You're not seeing the anger as who you are, but it's a reaction in your body. And you start to notice what that feels like when anger arises. And instead of reacting to that, you just go back to your breath, focusing on your breath as opposed to focusing on the anger. So then Ty goes on to say, the second thing that you can do, you can say, or maybe even write it down, I am doing my best. So you focus on that breath, and then you tell yourself, I am doing my breath. He says, this means I'm practicing not to say anything, not to do anything with anger, because I know that in doing so, I will create more suffering. And we will create some suffering, likely for that other person, but we're creating suffering for ourselves when we react with anger. And then Ty goes on with the final step of this, and he says that you can then say to that other person, I need your help. And he goes on to say, usually when we get angry with someone, we want to do the opposite. We want to say, I don't need you. I can survive myself alone. But when we say, I need your help, what it means is I need your practice. I need your deep looking. I need you to help me to overcome this anger because I suffer. And if I suffer, then there's no way that you can be happy because happiness is not an individual matter. So helping the other person to suffer less, to smile, will make you happy too. So let's just kind of try that. Let's just kind of see how it goes for us. So first of all, of course, we'll get our comfortable seated position. Perhaps you're sitting in a chair or on a cushion. Perhaps it's even more comfortable for you to lay down on your back. If you're sitting in an upright position, your back is strong and straight so that your ears can be over your shoulders and your shoulders over your hips. Your back is strong, your abdomen is soft and relaxed, and your heart is open to whatever comes up. And we just start to breathe, considering what it feels like when we let go of anger and allow our heart to be open. Now, we're not just stuffing that anger deeper down inside of us. We're allowing ourselves to fully experience what that feels like. And knowing that that anger is not who we are. So perhaps consider a situation you've had. Now, since this is something we're practicing, we don't want to make this the most serious, the most traumatic situation that has happened to us that has brought us a lot of anger. Maybe consider a situation where you've had a disagreement with a family member. Maybe they've said or something that really got to you. And your reaction perhaps was to lash out at that person. Perhaps we won't even talk about physical violence, but the violence of language. Perhaps you said something that was hurtful to that person. So you envisioned that that person was hurtful to you, which brought rise to anger. And then you lashed out in your words, perhaps saying something mean or hateful back to that other person. So let's now just imagine that we're experiencing that again. We experience someone saying that hateful thing to us, or what we perceived as hateful at least. And in those few seconds before that anger really takes a hold of us, we just focus on the present moment, focusing on our breath, breathing in and out, focusing on the in-breath. The anger may still be a feeling that's there, but it's not overtaking our consciousness because we're focusing on our breath. We just breathe in and out, noticing how focusing on our breath can help us to relax our body, help us to dissipate that tension that often builds up when that feeling of anger arises. Considering how anger reflects our own fear. How someone has merely said something, but it's felt harmful to us. It's brought about a certain level of trauma and fear. It's brought about that fear response where we can act in fight or flight. And in this situation, we're not going to fight. But we're not going to run away. We're not going to stuff it in us. We're going to focus on our breathing and notice how, just like our thoughts come and go, these emotional reactions rise up in us and then begin to dissipate, lessening and lessening until that feeling is actually gone. And then, as Ty reminds us in this situation, we just tell ourselves, I'm doing the best I can. The situation may not be perfect. We may not think of the exact right thing to say to that person in that moment that would bring about compassion. But we just remind ourselves, I'm doing the best I can. And then perhaps in that situation that you're reflecting back on, you can then consider that person is suffering. Why did they say a mean or hateful thing to you? They're suffering. It reflects their own suffering. And when we consider that other person, especially if it's a person that's important to you and you really care about, and we consider how they're actually suffering, then instead of anger, we begin to feel compassion. Perhaps we need to sit with that compassion for a moment. Or perhaps that compassion is strong enough with us at that moment that we can engage in compassionate listening. Perhaps we can find the right words to tell that person that we recognize their suffering and we are there for them. We are not angry at them because we know what they said was not about us at all, but it was about their own suffering being directed, or perhaps we should say misdirected, outside of themselves. And you just happen to be the person there at that moment in time. And perhaps when you recognize that compassion in that person and you open up a dialogue for compassionate listening, well, that other person may just be able to let go of their own anger, of their fear, and be open to a dialogue with you. And as that happens, you continue to focus on your breath, noticing again the feelings inside of you as they rise and they fall. Perhaps even considering that phrase most of us have heard, this too will pass. Breathing in, breathing out. Now I know that it's not always that simple. And sometimes we may choose not to respond to a situation, not to make a physical effort, Perhaps you did try that before and the person wasn't really ready to accept that. And so there's ways that you can respond, perhaps just by sending love to that person, thinking of that person, wishing them the best, considering that your wishes that you're making will reach that person as they struggle with their own suffering. As one of my teachers says, just approaching the situation by how can I be of help? How can I be of assistance? And the other person may be responsive. And maybe you just need to send them those thoughts without verbalizing them. Knowing that you're ready to be there for them when they're ready to recognize their own suffering. And so let's just sit with that feeling for a moment or two. The feeling that comes up in us when we let go of the anger and allow that compassionate being inside of us to really shine. And so we just sit together for just a few more moments, noticing what it feels like in our body right now as we sit with compassion, as we let go of the anger. Again, not stuffing it down to where it comes back at another time, but just gently holding that anger, noticing what it is, and noticing how it can be transformed. And knowing that by practicing letting go in our meditation, well, whether we practice just letting go of our thoughts, letting go of the feelings, just practicing the act of bringing our attention back to our breath over and over, then that practice becomes available to us in our normal everyday life when it's helpful to us. And so I'd just like to read a little bit more about what Ty has written here, because he's started this article in terms of his response to the Vietnam War and to that level of violence that we have in our society. So he says, there are people everywhere in the world that consider vengeance as their deepest desire. They become terrorists. When they have hatred and vengeance, when we have hatred and vengeance as our deepest desire, we will suffer terribly also. Our deepest desire should be to love, to help, and not to revenge, not to punish, not to kill. Hatred can never answer hatred. All violence is injustice. Responding to violence with violence can only bring more violence and injustice, more suffering, not only to other people, but suffering to ourselves. This is the wisdom that is in every one of us. We need to breathe deeply to get calm in order to touch the seed of wisdom, which can bring a lot of relief. That is why my suggestion is the practice of being calm, being concentrated, and watering the seeds of wisdom and compassion that are already in us. This is a true revolution, the only kind that can help us get out from this difficult situation where violence and hatred prevail. And so I consider those words, and he's writing those to some extent in response to how countries engage in war with other countries when they have disagreement. But, there can also be a war inside of us. Those feelings can be that strong. Inside of us, how we feel about others, how we react to others. And so this wisdom that Ty refers to can be helpful to us, whether it's a little, spat we're having with a loved one, or whether it's as big as how countries relate to each other in this world. And we can all just practice our deep breathing, practice our focus on mindfulness, and see how that can help us. So I'd just like to thank you for joining me today. I'd like to encourage you to check out our website, ebslr.org. You can look at different practices that we have online right now, and see if maybe one of those really calls out to you. If you would like more structure or guidance with your meditation, well, that's one way you can do that. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope your day is beautiful.